December 26, 1991, Moscow. The red flag descends from the Kremlin for the final time. The Soviet Union, a superpower that once controlled 11 time zones and 40,000 nuclear warheads, ceases to exist. History books will tell you it collapsed because communism failed, because Reagan won the arms race, because the people demanded freedom. That's the narrative we've been fed for 3 decades. But here's the truth that accountants know, and politicians won't say out loud. The Soviet Union didn't lose the Cold War on a battlefield. It lost it on a balance sheet. They didn't run out of soldiers. They ran out of cash. The empire that could vaporize the planet 10 times over couldn't afford to buy bread for its citizens. This is the story of how a kingdom in the desert and a spy in Washington weaponized the one thing more powerful than missiles. They weaponized the oil market, and they used it to bankrupt a superpower. In 1980, if you stood in Red Square and watched the May Day parade, you would see an empire at the height of its power. Tanks rolled past the Kremlin walls. Intercontinental ballistic missiles mounted on trucks crawled through the streets like mechanical dinosaurs. 4 million men in uniform stood ready to march westward across Europe. The Soviet Union stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. It controlled Eastern Europe like a landlord controls his properties. It had client states from Cuba to Vietnam, from Angola to Afghanistan. The empire consumed 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. To Western observers in London and Washington, the Soviet bear looked terrifying. It looked permanent. It looked like it would last 1,000 years. But if you ignored the parades and instead walked into the offices of the Soviet Ministry of Finance, you would see something very different. You would see ledgers that told a story of decay. You would see an economy that was hollow at its core. The factories were inefficient, producing goods that nobody wanted to buy. The collective farms couldn't grow enough wheat to feed 280 million people. The technology lagged decades behind the West. Soviet computers were the size of refrigerators and had less power than a modern calculator. The consumer goods were so shabby that citizens hoarded toilet paper and stood in line for hours to buy shoes. The entire system was rotting from the inside, but the leadership in the Politburo had found a way to hide the rot. They had found a miracle drug that kept the patient alive. That drug was oil. Specifically, it was high-priced crude oil. In the 1970s, the Soviet Union got lucky in a way that would prove fatal. The Arab oil embargo of 1973 sent energy prices into the stratosphere. Oil that had sold for $3 a barrel suddenly sold for $12, then $20, then $30. The Soviet Union, which sat on top of massive reserves in Siberia, became a gusher of hard currency. Billions of dollars in cash flooded into Moscow every single year. It was a windfall that allowed the aging men in the Kremlin to paper over every crack in their broken system. They used the oil money to buy grain from America and Canada because their own farms had failed. They used it to purchase Western technology they couldn't invent themselves. They used it to subsidize the economies of East Germany and Poland and Hungary. They used it to fund military adventures in Afghanistan and proxy wars in Africa. They used it to build more tanks and more missiles. As long as the price of oil stayed high, the illusion could continue. The party could go on forever. By 1980, the Soviet Union had transformed into something dangerous and fragile. It was no longer a diversified industrial giant. It had become a Petro-State, no different from Libya or Nigeria or Venezuela. 80% of its hard currency earnings came from selling oil and natural gas to the West. Think about that number. 80%. The entire empire, the entire military machine, the entire credibility of the communist system rested on the price of a single commodity. They were an addict, and like all addicts, they believed the supply would never run out. They believed the high would last forever. They built their budgets assuming oil would stay at $30 a barrel. They borrowed money from Western banks assuming the collateral was solid. They made 5-year plans that depended entirely on energy revenue. It was the most dangerous dependency in the world. And in Washington, a new team of cold warriors had noticed the weakness. In January 1981, Ronald Reagan took the oath of office on the steps of the Capitol. He brought with him a cabinet of hardliners who were tired of détente, tired of coexistence, tired of accepting Soviet power as a permanent fact. They didn't want to contain the Soviet Union. They wanted to defeat it. Among them was a man named William Casey, the newly appointed Director of Central Intelligence. Casey was not a typical bureaucrat. He was an old-school spy who had run operations behind Nazi lines during World War II. He understood that wars were not just won with bullets and bombs. They were won with money, with logistics, with economic strangulation. Casey looked at the Soviet Union the way a forensic accountant looks at a bankrupt company. He wanted to see the books. Casey ordered a classified study of the Soviet economy. He told his analysts to dig into the numbers, to follow the money, to find the pressure points. The report that landed on his desk in late 1981 was a revelation. It confirmed what he suspected. The Soviet Union was not a superpower. It was a Potemkin village propped up by petrodollars. The CIA economists calculated that the Kremlin needed oil to stay above a certain price threshold just to meet its basic obligations. If the price dropped significantly, the entire system would go into cardiac arrest. The report identified the Achilles heel of the evil empire. It wasn't their army. It wasn't their missiles. It was their budget. Casey realized he had found a way to win the Cold War without firing a shot. But there was a problem. The United States couldn't lower the price of oil on its own. America was a net importer, a buyer in the market, not a seller. To crash the price, Casey needed a partner. He needed a country with so much oil that it could flood the global market and drown the Soviet economy in oversupply. He needed the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The relationship between Washington and Riyadh in the early 80s was complicated and transactional. The Saudis were officially neutral in the Cold War. They controlled the OPEC cartel, and they liked high oil prices because it made the royal family obscenely wealthy. Why on earth would they agree to crash the price of their own product just to help America fight the Russians? Casey knew he had to offer them something more valuable than money. He had to offer them survival. The Middle East in 1982 was a terrifying place for the House of Saud. The Iranian Revolution had just toppled the Shah, their ally. The Ayatollah Khomeini was calling for Islamic uprisings across the region. The Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan and was creeping closer to the Persian Gulf oil fields. Syrian and Iraqi dictators threatened Saudi borders. The royal family saw enemies on every side. They were rich, but they were vulnerable. And that vulnerability was the opening Casey needed. In the spring of 1982, William Casey flew to Riyadh. The meetings took place in private palaces far from the eyes of diplomats and journalists. There are no transcripts. There are no official records. But we know what happened next, and we can reconstruct the deal from the outcome. Casey painted a picture of existential threat. He told the Saudis that the Soviets were encircling the Middle East, that Moscow was funding communist insurgencies, that the kingdom was next on the list. He made an offer. He promised absolute American military protection. He promised advanced weapons systems. He promised a WACS surveillance planes and Stinger missiles. He promised that if the Soviet Union ever threatened Saudi Arabia, the full power of the United States military would respond. The House of Saud would never fall, but Casey wanted something in return. He wanted the Saudis to open the oil taps. He wanted them to flood the market. He wanted them to destroy the price. The Saudi leadership hesitated. Lowering oil prices would hurt their own revenue in the short term. But Casey made a compelling argument. He told them it was better to be slightly less rich and completely safe than to be wealthy and conquered. He also appealed to their religious duty. The Soviets were slaughtering Muslims in Afghanistan. By bankrupting Moscow, the Saudis would be striking a blow for Islam. The argument worked. The alliance was formed. It was a secret economic suicide pact signed in the sand. The Saudis agreed to act as the swing producer, to manipulate global supply, to weaponize their reserves. And in exchange they received the protection of the world's most powerful military. It was one of the most consequential deals of the 20th century, and almost nobody knew it existed. While Casey worked the diplomatic back channels, the Reagan administration launched a broader campaign of economic warfare. They blocked the construction of a massive natural gas pipeline the Soviets were building to supply Europe. They convinced European banks to stop lending to Moscow. They forced the Soviets to spend more and more on defense to keep up with American military buildup. The Strategic Defense Initiative, mockingly called Star Wars, was never really about building a space laser. It was about forcing the Soviets to spend money they didn't have. Every $1 billion Moscow diverted to defense was $1 billion they couldn't spend on food or consumer goods or infrastructure. The goal was to stretch the Soviet budget to the breaking point. And then when the oil shock came, the system would snap like a dry branch. By 1985, the trap was set. In Moscow, a new leader had taken power. Mikhail Gorbachev was young, energetic, and reform-minded. He knew the Soviet economy was in trouble. He launched a program called Perestroika, which meant restructuring. He wanted to modernize the factories, to centralize decision-making, introduce market incentives. He genuinely believed he could save the system, but Gorbachev was operating under a fatal assumption. He assumed the oil money would keep flowing. He wrote his budgets based on oil staying at $30 a barrel. He believed he had time. He believed he had a financial cushion. He didn't know that William Casey and the Saudi king had already pulled the rug out from under him. In the summer of 1985, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia made its move. For years, the Saudis had acted as the responsible swing producer within OPEC. When other members cheated on their production quotas, the Saudis cut their own output to keep prices high for everyone. They were tired of this role. They were losing market share to countries that were producing more while Saudi Arabia held back. In September 1985, the Saudi oil minister, Ahmed Zaki Yamani, made a quiet but devastating announcement. Saudi Arabia would no longer defend the oil price. Instead, the kingdom would fight for market share. It sounded like a boring technical shift in energy policy. But in the trading pits of New York and London, the professionals understood what it meant. The dam had broken. The Saudis turned on the pumps. Saudi Arabia had enormous surplus capacity, wells that had been capped to keep supply tight. Within weeks, they flooded the market with millions of extra barrels every single day. The world was suddenly drowning in oil. Supply far exceeded demand. The laws of economics took over with brutal efficiency. The price began to fall. It dropped from $30 to $28, then to $25, then to $20. Panic spread through the oil markets. Traders who had bet on high prices were wiped out overnight. But in Moscow, the initial reaction was confusion. Soviet planners had seen price fluctuations before. They assumed this was temporary, that the market would correct itself. They didn't realize this was a structural shift, a deliberate act of economic sabotage engineered by their enemies. They kept spending money as if nothing had changed. They kept fighting the war in Afghanistan. They kept subsidizing Eastern Europe. They kept building weapons. They were burning through their hard currency reserves at a catastrophic rate, waiting for the price to bounce back. But the price didn't bounce back. It kept falling. As winter turned to spring in 1986, the oil market went into free fall. The Saudis were relentless, pumping millions of barrels a day. They were teaching the rest of OPEC a lesson about cheating on quotas. But the collateral damage was annihilating the Soviet Union. Every $1 drop in the price of a barrel cost Moscow roughly $1 billion in lost annual revenue. When the price hit $15, they lost $15 billion. When it dropped to $12, they lost $18 billion. When it crashed to $10 a barrel in the summer of 1986, the Soviet Union lost more than $20 billion a year in income. Let that number sink in. $20 billion. That was money they desperately needed to import grain because the collective farms couldn't feed the population. It was money they needed to buy technology and machinery. It was money they needed to service the debts they had racked up in the 1970s. Without it, the lights started going out. The dependency on imported grain is hard to overstate. The inefficiency of Soviet agriculture meant the superpower literally could not feed itself. They relied on American and Canadian wheat, and they had to pay in hard currency or gold. They couldn't pay in rubles because the ruble was a closed currency with no value outside the USSR. Nobody wanted rubles. So oil revenue was bread. When the oil price crashed, the bread supply broke. By early 1986, Soviet officials were in a state of quiet panic. Finance ministers sent secret memos to Gorbachev. The message was simple and terrifying. The coffers were empty. The reserves were gone. The state could not afford to import the machinery needed to modernize industry. They might have to cut imports of consumer goods. Gorbachev was facing a nightmare. He had promised the Soviet people reform, modernization, a better future. But you cannot reform an economy when you're bankrupt. You can only manage the decline. And then the worst possible thing happened. In April 1986, the nuclear reactor at Chernobyl exploded. It was the most catastrophic industrial accident in human history. The cleanup and containment cost the Soviet Union billions of dollars. Entire cities had to be evacuated. Thousands of workers had to be paid. The international humiliation was incalculable. It was a massive, unexpected expense at the exact moment when their income had evaporated. It was the perfect storm, a financial attack combined with a technological disaster. Gorbachev was overwhelmed, but the Americans didn't let up. They kept the pressure on. They encouraged the Saudis to keep prices low. They reminded Riyadh that the strategy was working, that the common enemy was bleeding out. The Saudis, who had enormous financial reserves and could weather the storm, kept the taps wide open. They drove the price down to levels that made Soviet oil production completely unprofitable. The Soviet oil fields in Siberia were expensive and difficult to operate. They required advanced drilling technology and operated in harsh Arctic conditions. At $10 a barrel, it cost the Soviets more to extract the oil than they could sell it for. Their greatest asset had become a liability. The psychological impact on the Soviet elite was devastating. For decades they had believed that history was on their side, that capitalism was weak and doomed, that communism was the future. But now they were receiving a brutal education in market economics. They realized their entire system was a house of cards built on the temporary luck of high energy prices. Without that luck, they were nothing. The confidence of the Communist Party began to crack. Factions turned on each other. Hardliners blamed Gorbachev for weakness. Gorbachev blamed the hardliners for inefficiency and corruption. But no faction could solve the fundamental problem. They were broke. The financial crisis triggered a chain reaction that would bring down the Berlin Wall. The Soviet Union had an empire to maintain. It controlled satellite states across Eastern Europe, East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. For decades, Moscow had subsidized these countries. They sold them cheap oil and gas. They provided direct financial aid. They stationed troops to keep the regimes in power. It was the glue that held the Warsaw Pact together. But when the money ran out in Moscow, the subsidies stopped. Gorbachev was forced to tell the leaders of Eastern Europe that they were on their own. The Soviet Union could no longer afford to support them. He called it the Sinatra Doctrine, meaning they could do it their way. But this wasn't generosity or enlightenment. It was insolvency. He cut them loose to save money. And once the people of Eastern Europe realized the Soviet tanks weren't coming because the Soviets couldn't afford the fuel, they rose up.